Welcome to this section on really basic C# programming. You should only watch this section if you have no idea how to program and no idea about the C# language. We're going to cover things like variables, integers, strings, numbers. How do you store all of these things? We'll look at how to manipulate those variables, things like addition, concatenation, which is a fancy word for adding two strings together. Then we'll move on to classes, because we need to have somewhere to store our variables, and classes are a logical way to do it. That's not the full story behind classes, but it will do for starters. Finally, we'll look at methods, which are simply little blocks of code that allow you to repeat a function wherever you call it from inside other blocks of code. Variables. What are they? A variable you can think of as a thing. This laptop that I'm using to record this tutorial is a variable. It's stored inside a special container that we like to call laptop. Your phone is a variable. It's stored inside a special phone container. So let's look at variables in the programming world and what that means. Open up Xamarin Studio. Right up at the top, hit File, New, File. Under the C# section, click Sketches, and then head over to xamarin.ios sketch. This allows us to write code and evaluate it almost immediately without going through all the hassle of making an app. Give it any name you like. I'll just call this test. And we are presented with an iPhone 5, which we shouldn't be. Let me go back over to Xamarin Studio. Okay, we're presented with a pane on the left-hand side that says sketch your next great idea. We have an empty pane next to that, and finally we have a console output. So the first thing that we can see in here are something called using statements, and these just import classes or bunches of code that allow us to use them inside of our project. Create some space under it, and the first thing we're going to look at is how to create an integer variable. In C#, this is simple enough. You type int, let's call this variable I is equal to, and then give it a number and end your line with a semicolon. So now we have our first variable, and it's called variable I. It's equal to 6, and it's stored inside a special container called int. Int stands for integer, which means a whole number. So this can contain -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, etc. There are limits to how much an integer can store, so I'll leave you to look that up if you want to know. But for now, just know that's how we declare variables in C#. I could also declare an integer, let's call this best p, I don't know why, and I could leave it unset. Now in C#, this is a little bit dangerous to do, because later on, if we try and access best p, we might get an error, as we haven't actually assigned a value to it. I believe that sometimes C# might just assign a value of 0 to integers that we haven't decided on yet, but it's always best to have it like this one at the top. You make it equal to a number. So what if you want to store a bit of text, a sentence, a word, a few characters, a whole paragraph, even a whole book? Well, we have a different variable for that, and that is a string, and I'm going to call this best string is equal to, and then we put inside quotes the text we want to store. So I've got Grant here. And you'll notice on the right we have this little console window that pops up and tells us exactly what we've stored. So that's a string. What if I want to create an integer but I don't want to write int? Well, I can write var. And var is just a general type that infers what it is from what you create. So I'll just explain that with an example. Let's have var sentence equal to. Now if I made that equal to 7, C# would infer that sentence was an integer because it's just a plain number. If I put something inside quotes, then C# would infer that that is a string, and it would make it so. Just know that if you then have a string in your var, I can't then reassign sentence equal to 9. That'll be an error. And over on the right, it says cannot implicitly convert type int to string. So you can't switch between integers, strings, or any other variable type. What you can do is come over to 9 and say dot to string, and you can store it as a string. So you'll notice here it's got a 9 in quotes, which isn't a number, that is a string. But Grant, you say, what if I have a number that is a decimal? Well, there are a couple of ways of storing those. We can use a float. And a float can be 7 point whatever we like. That is a float variable. But if you do that, you'll get an error. And it says literal of type double cannot be implicitly converted to type float, which is a big fancy word, a big fancy sentence to say, please add f to the end of your number. And if you add an f, it makes it into a float. There's another way of storing a decimal, and that's double, and then a number, decimal, and end. And that doesn't require anything on the end of it. Okay, there's one more kind of variable that we should discuss, and it's one we are going to use a lot inside of our programming, and that's a Boolean. Bool, true or false, is equal to, and this can only have one of two values. The first one is true, and the next one is false. So it's either on or off. And this is handy, as you can imagine, if you were making an application that played music. You would have a Boolean that kept track of whether or not your music was actually playing. So is playing would be true or false. And we're going to use Booleans quite a lot. Okay, there's one last thing to do in this little tutorial, and that's something I've already done, but I didn't explicitly say that I'd done it, and that's reassigning to variables. So I can take best string up here, and I can make it equal to something else. So now, if I just type best string, you'll notice over on the right, it now says player. So we've overwritten the original value inside of it, i.e. we can reassign values into our variables. Okay, that concludes this very short and quick tutorial on variables in C#. There are a lot more variables to use, things like lists, but I'm going to cover those much later on inside of the actual course that this beginner section is targeted at. In the last lecture, we looked at variables inside of C#, and we went ahead and created a few different types of them. Let's clear out what we've got inside of our sketch file and start afresh. In this section, we're going to look at manipulating those variables and what we can do with each one. So let's create a couple variables first. Let's have some integers. Integer num1 is equal to 6. Let's have integer num2 is equal to 15. Now, what if I wanted to add those numbers? That's no problem. I can make a new integer. I can say integer answer is equal to num1 plus num2. And over in the right hand side you'll see the number 21 appear. And of course we can do the same if we want to subtract them. So I'll just change this to a minus. The answer is -9. What happens if I want to multiply? Well, I hit asterisk and it multiplies them for us. Now, here's a tricky one. What if I say the second number is 12 and let's try num2 divided by is a / num1. You would expect this to come out at 2, and you'd be correct. But what if I made num2 15? The answer should now be 2.5 on this line, but it's still 2. Why is that? Well, it's because integer can only store a whole number. It can't store a decimal. So what does it do? It just drops the half and forgets about it. It doesn't round, doesn't do anything like that. So how do we get around this problem? Well, let's try make the answer into a double. And we still have the same problem. Why is that? Because this section is evaluated first, and that evaluation is going to become an integer, which is then stored inside of answer. So it doesn't matter if I have a double, a float. It really doesn't matter what I have there. I'm still going to have 2. So what's the solution for this? Well, it's really to change these numbers to an appropriate type. So let's have these set as double and double, and then let's set this answer as a double. And now we get our decimal appearing, 2.5. So always be aware of the type when you're multiplying, dividing. It's not so important with addition and subtraction, but definitely division is a problem. Okay, so we can do all kinds of maths functions inside numbers. What about strings, you say? Well, let's create some. Let's have string word1 is equal to Grant. Oh, I haven't put a semicolon on that line. That's why this is indenting. Let's create string word2 equal to is, and string word3 equal to awesome. You can see where I'm going with this, can't you? Right, what if I wanted to make all of those words into a sentence? Well, we can use addition with strings. So let's type string sentence is equal to word1 plus word2 plus word3. And there we have our badly formed sentence called Grant is awesome. That's me, by the way. But there are no spaces in it. How do we get around that? Well, we can add strings on the fly. So after word 1, we can hit plus, we can put quote space quote, and it will add a space for us. And of course, we can do the same after word 2. Plus, quote space quote. And we have word 3. So we can do that on the fly. Just bear in mind, these aren't actually stored anywhere. They're used once and then discarded. Now, you'll be shocked to know you can't actually multiply strings. So we can't say word 1 times word. It doesn't even let us complete it. We have a console output error. The type or namespace word 1 could not be found. So, we can't multiply and we can't divide strings, but we can manipulate them and smash them all together. We can also find things that are attached to the string class, the double class, the integer class, etc. And the way we do that is typing our variable sentence and then putting a dot. And this opens up all of the methods that we're going to cover in a future lecture that allow us to manipulate that string quickly and easily. So if we can scroll down, we can look at things like length, and this tells us that there are 16 characters inside of our string. We can also have something like to upper, and what that's going to do when I put my brackets in is uppercase everything. But that isn't stored anywhere. So if I type sentence, we still have the original stored item. If I perform a function on a variable, but I don't actually say sentence is equal to sentence to upper, then it won't store it. We can also have sentence to lower, to lowercase everything, etc., etc. You get the idea. If I get my num1 and I put a dot, I have fewer options here. One of them, we've already covered, is toString, so I can make it into a string if I wish. Okay, that covers basic variable manipulation in C#. In the last lecture, we looked at variable manipulation in C#. Now, as long as you've got a few variables, we can just lay them out pretty much wherever we like. But when you get to programming, you're going to want to actually store these somewhere. Now, logically, you'd think we'd store all of our variables in one big file called variables. But our variables normally are required to perform functions inside of certain blocks of code. And this is where this concept of classes comes in. So I'm going to remove all of this code so far, and we're going to create a class. A class is a simple way of thinking about a big block of code with lots of variables in it, methods, things it can do. We've already come across classes right at the top here. UIKit is a class, Foundation, and Core Graphics. These are all iPhone-specific classes. And when we say things like using, we're importing it into this file and saying, I would like you to have ready for me all of the things that come with that class so I can use it. Let's create our own class. How do we do that? Well, we type public class, and we will call this own class. And then we have to open a curly brace and close a curly brace. Now, every variable we write can be stored inside of this class. So let's have an integer of num1 equal to 6 and an integer of num2 is equal to 15. Now we're getting an error in our console output at the side here because the Xamarin Sketches isn't actually configured to create classes and methods inside of the sketch function. But I'll simply soldier on and explain this class concept to you anyway. So we have these two numbers and they are stored inside of ownClass. If I wanted to access these variables from some other class, so if I had a public class 2, I wouldn't be able to access them because at the moment these are private. They are private because inside of a class, by default, you can't see anything unless you put the public keyword in front of it. But we always want to keep our variables as private inside of a class. This ensures that our code doesn't become what they call spaghetti code, where we access variables from all different kinds of classes and files, and it makes a big mess and we don't know what's changing our variables, when and how. So, always store your variables inside of classes and don't make them public so that other classes can access them. If you need to access them, what you'll do is create an access method. And I'm going to show you exactly what a method is in the next tutorial. In the last tutorial, we learnt how to make a class as a place where we store all of our variables and bits of code. There's much more to it than that, of course, but as a basic idea, that will suffice for now. Now we have this concept called a method, and you can think of a method as a block of code that performs a function. The way we declare a method is by typing something like public void add numbers. Now when we open a bracket, which is part of the method declaration, we can pass it over some variables. So I can say you're going to receive an integer of number 1. Whoops, that's Xamarin's error. Integer of number 1 and an integer of number 2. And then I open some curly braces and close them. So now I've got a method. This public void section is called a method. You don't have to pass in items, but generally you will do. Inside of here, I can have an integer answer equal to, and then I can access the number 1 that was passed in plus the number 2. And this will create an answer that's equal to number 1 plus number 2. So you'll notice this method has nothing to do with these variables. So what if I wanted to add these variables together? Well, I'd need to call the method. So let's say I was in some other random place inside some other code. I could have something along the lines of, this isn't completely true, but along the lines of ownClass.add numbers, and then I could pass it over some numbers like 9 and 10. And what that would do is go into this class, pop over to this method, and create an answer out of them. That is basically what a method is. A method stores a little block of code. What if I wanted to get that answer back? Well, what I could do is come under this line and say return answer. And then inside of the method, I would modify it, and I would have int, because I'm going to return an integer. Before, when I had void, void means I return nothing, so nothing is expected. But when I have integer, I'm explicitly saying every time you call this method, you're going to return a number and it will be an integer. Then down in ownClass.addNumbers, we can create another variable called var answer equal to. And these two variables, answer here and answer here, don't know about each other's existence, which is why they can have the same name. So down here, it accesses this variable, adds the numbers, and creates an answer for us. So, as some general advice for your programming career, you should make your methods very small. They should generally do 1 or 2 functions, maybe 3 at most. Because the power of methods lies in the fact that you can reuse them as you create your application. So I can use that addNumbers method wherever I am in whatever part of my application. I can also come into the addNumbers method. I can change things around if I want to, and that means that everywhere that calls the addNumbers method is also changed. So that's the real power of methods, is you can change your code in one place and it changes everywhere that you need to use that code. Congratulations, you finished this section on basic C# programming. You learnt how to create variables, things like numbers and strings. You learnt how to manipulate those variables, how to add, multiply, subtract, and divide numbers. There were a few gotchas. When you divided an integer, your result wasn't quite as expected because integers dropped the decimal ending. Then I showed you what a class is. At its core level, a class is somewhere that we store our blocks of code and variables in an ordered manner that makes sense to us as the developer. That's of course not the full story for classes, not by a long way. They're much more powerful than I've just described, and you'll get into that as we go through this course. Finally, we looked at methods and exactly what they are. Methods were basically a little block of code that was enclosed in a little function that can be called from anywhere else that you like. This is powerful because you only need to change the code in one place if you effectively want to change it everywhere. Okay, that summarizes a really quick and really basic approach to C# programming.